Morning, everybody. Welcome to the first panel of the day. So what I wanted to do is, kick off timely. If we run late, I think it will affect the entire day. That's I think the pressure of being on the first panel. But what I wanted to do first was let everybody introduce themselves. So I'm Gary Sklar. Can you hear me okay? I help lead business development and licensing and new company creation for the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. And I'm very fortunate to be moderating a panel with Genevieve Gerton, Bill Bra, and Kuldeep Niote. And I was going to allow them to introduce themselves. Go ahead, Bill.
Seems to be the only mic without a wire. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Wow, it's magic. I am an assistant vice provost of research at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And the reason I am here is because in 2009 we opened what was at the time one of the first life science incubators in the city. Now there are many. And I've had a bunch of experience with several companies that have done quite well, and one of them that has not done well at all in cell and gene therapy, and that's what I hope to share with you today. But just to complete the commercial, 2018 was a pretty amazing year for the companies that we've incubated. We've done 95 companies so far. They've raised about $700 million in venture financing. But in 2018, we had two major developments. We had an acquisition of one of our companies by Amazon for $1 billion. That was PillPack, an IT company. And then a company that I'll talk about today, Squeeze Biotech, did a $1 billion deal with Roche. And I got to hear all of the drama and be part of it. So I hope to share some lessons learned with you.
Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Genevieve Gertin. I come from Solidarité. We are an institutional investor based in Montreal. We were created by a union 35 years ago. We're now independently managed. We have close to 15 billion Canadian in assets under management, all sectors of the economy, and I belong to the team that gets to do the fun stuff, which is life science. So we invest about 100 million per year, split between direct investment in companies and specialized funds. People who buy our shares, we raise money from the public every year, an average 800 million per year, so we're a very green fund. People who buy our shares get a tax credit as an incentive to save money for their retirement. So you can think of us as a balanced mutual fund that's for your retirement fund. The flip side of it is that the government asks us to invest a significant portion of our assets in our geography. So despite this restriction in our investment policy, we've been able, to be a very profitable saving vehicle for our investors, even before taking into account the tax credit. And we've also been able to build a interesting life science portfolio. So we have 18 biotech, one specialty pharma, and we have a stable of about 7 families of funds, both Canadian, US-based, and European. We have in our portfolio one company that we like to call gene therapy, even though it's not a replacement of a faulty gene. It's a non-viral delivery mechanism of plasmid in order to trigger production of therapeutic proteins in mucosal tissues. And I think Kuldeep happens to know the file very well because we have Johnson & Johnson as an investor in the company and also as a partner. And we are currently looking for a cell therapy addition to the company. So I will use our own experience to answer Gary's questions about that in the future.
Thank you. My name is Kuldeep Niote, and I am one of the new venture leads in the J&J Innovation Center. And really, in a nutshell, what we do at the J&J Innovation Center is we make investments in very, very early stage opportunities that are before clinical proof of concept. We tend to make strategic investments that are of interest to J&J, but we also make investments in innovation that we believe is going to have breakthrough opportunities to really address unmet medical needs that are not currently addressed. So consequently, we do make investments and form partnerships, collaborations, even with academia, not to mention help new co-creation. Very quickly, my background, I trained as a molecular biologist, but I've been in the pharmaceutical industry all my life, all my career pretty well. Pfizer, Lilly. In the last 6 or so years of my career, I've had an external R&D role looking for opportunities to make investments in. And as you can imagine, being in the Innovation Center, we come across all the cutting edge technologies, therapeutics that we invest in, and certainly cell-based therapies and gene therapies. It's right up there. So I've had the good fortune of interacting with a lot of companies that are in that space.
Thank you. So as we start really getting into the discussion, I just wanted to point out a few things. If people don't know, right now there are about 400 CAR T trials worldwide. Some of the issues we're going to talk about are, the tremendously high cost of these trials, and the way the world is right now, the ancillary costs around taking care of patients is greater than the actual therapy itself. The lentivirus is about $25,000 per patient. There's a lot of work being done with Sleeping Beauty, which would bring the cost from $25K per patient to $1,000 per patient. We might touch upon that a bit. And when people look at these investments, the high costs are balanced with investor enthusiasm. I'm sure we're going to talk about that as well. But to kick things off, I was going to ask Kuldeep if you could wax poetic about cell and gene therapy, just to ground ourselves on what it is and where things stand from a technological perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'll try to be very brief, and I'll trust my panelists to tell me I should shut up and stop talking and have more of a panel discussion and certainly a discussion with you, the audience. So, Gary mentioned very briefly CAR-Ts. Certainly CAR-Ts is one aspect that has really made a huge impact on accepting cell-based therapies. I think there was a lot of challenges before that, and I don't need to remind you that Provence, which was a cell-based therapy for prostate cancer, was a good example that failed miserably and did not really make it in the market. But you briefly mentioned 2 CAR-Ts that have been approved. Yescarta, one of them, Kymra is the other one from Novartis. And it's one thing getting approval, it's another thing actually demonstrating real-world evidence that these therapies do indeed work. That the initial efficacy that was observed in the phase 3 clinical studies, the pivotal studies, continues to give similar type of clinical responses. But more importantly, that there are no adverse events associated with that. And at ASH last year in December, real-world evidence was presented for these CD19-based CAR-Ts that actually showed that we do not need to worry about safety concern, given that they have the potential to have a cytokine storm. So I think that was very, very enlightening. That was very, very sort of almost this is great that these therapies certainly are going to stay, and they are going to, if anything, be expanded. So given that, I just wanted to point out very briefly to get into the nitty-gritty of the discussion of this panel is, where is the future of cell-based therapies? Certainly, pursuing novel cancer antigens is a major force push right now. Gary mentioned there's 400 CAR-Ts that are being pursued, and if I understand correctly, I think there's well over a dozen antigens that are being pursued with those. J&J very recently did a deal with a Chinese company, Legend, and acquired the BSMA CAR-T for malignancies. This is a Chinese-based company, and China, you can very quickly pursue clinical studies, and we hope we can learn from those clinical studies and then pursue development in the rest of the world, including the U.S. There's a lot of other interesting approaches that are being done where novel engineered receptors are being created. This includes the signaling component of the CAR T construct and activating immunomodulatory, immunostimulatory pathways in combinations now that we understand so much of how T cells are activated, T cells are suppressed, and which subset of T cells are important for tumor killing activity. There's also a push to put in what are called kill switches into the engineered CAR Ts. So if for any reason, the safety concern and any adverse events are completely something that needs to be addressed, that you can very quickly kill those CAR T cells. There's a number of companies that are pursuing that. There's a big push in getting away from an autologous approach and pursuing an allogeneic approach so that you can pursue off-the-shelf CAR T constructs. And you can imagine there's many different ways of doing that. One of them is to actually use NK cells as the killer cells, and they express far less major histocompatibility genes and have a fewer chance of getting rejected in non-matched recipients. I have a list of companies that are working on that I can mention very briefly. There's a company, Autologous, that is using.
Excuse me, it's just a little hard to hear. Can you move maybe?
Oh, absolutely.
Thanks for the feedback.
My apologies. Is that better?
Much better. Thank
Okay,
you.
all right. I do have a soft voice. It's a company that's pursuing a CAR T construct that's very similar to bispecific antibodies, where they recognize two different cancer antigens, and the thinking is that will give a higher clinical strategy. There are other companies that are using gene editing technologies, which is something that we can very briefly touch on. And these gene editing technologies hopefully will bring the cost down, just the way you mentioned, Gary, that you can use Sleeping Beauty to generate these these cells, these engineered cells, as opposed to using viral-based vectors, which really brings up the cost. So we can certainly have a discussion on the type of companies that are pursuing these novel approaches. I do want to very briefly mention before we move on to cell-based therapies, and what's the status there, is that cell-based therapeutics are not all restricted to obviously oncology. There's a huge growth in the number of cell-based therapies for regenerative medicine purposes. So iPS cells, stem cell-based therapies is really an area that's growing a lot. So just to give you some numbers, there's about 60 clinical trials ongoing using iPS cells in various disease indications, including regenerating neurons in Parkinson's disease, including replacing myocardiocytes that have died because of cardiac ischemic scenarios. And just to give you some aspect, Blue Rock, which is a pluripotent stem cell-based company that's pursuing cardiomyocytes as replacement therapeutics in their own cell replacement therapeutics, raised about $225 million, and they are currently in phase 1 with these studies. So I don't want you to leave with the impression that it's only CAR Ts where cell-based therapeutics are being pursued, but there are other disease indications that are very interesting. And it's interesting to note that Japan is one of the actual leaders in the area of stem cell biology, and they have very quickly translated a lot of the basic discoveries in stem cell biology into potential therapeutics. And again, I have a list of companies that work on that, and we can certainly discuss that after this thing. Let me very quickly turn into sort of the status of gene-based gene therapy, and very quickly tell you that by definition, gene therapy is really the delivery of genes to cells, either ex vivo, and then putting those cells into a patient, or actually delivering the genes in the patient itself. And you mentioned the example of Engene, which is an investment that J&J has made in a gene delivery platform, which really is a formulation technology that very, very efficiently delivers genes into cells by administering the formulated DNA and the formulated gene into the cell. I think one of the best examples of the success of this approach is Spinraza, which is a spinal muscular atrophy therapeutic that got approved, I think about a year ago. And this is a nucleic acid-based therapeutic that modulates, one of the SMN2 genes that's very important to upregulate, to really try to increase the expression of that protein, which really is the basic molecular pathology of disease. There's a lot of other gene therapy-based clinical trials that look very promising. For example, hemophilia trials. There's 2 ongoing trials where factor IX deficiency and the transfer of genes expressing factor IX are being put into hematopoietic cells, and those are being transferred into the patient to actually prevent bleeding episodes. So again, a lot going on, and finally, gene editing approaches have really have the potential to revolutionize gene-based therapies. Introducing cells using CRISPR-based technologies, or TALEN-based technologies, or zinc finger-based technologies is really something that's going to come. And finally, the fusion of gene therapies with cell-based therapies is an area that's really going to explode. That hopefully will address a lot of the challenges that are being faced with cell-based therapies. So I try to cover a lot, but I hope that gives you a sense that Gary will allow us to continue to perhaps go deeper into some of the aspects of this.
No, thank you for that comprehensive high-level overview, and it really helps us set the table to really looking at the business side of cell and gene therapy. I have one interesting piece of data that has not been fact-checked. I found it myself. I'm a little skeptical, but according to information I was able to find, over the last 4 years, 38 IO startups have been launched, in the United States. So let's say that at least 38 IO startups have been launched over the last 4 years. I just wanted to kind of frame what the market, what the investor community is like in this area. And along those lines, what I wanted to do is really switch the conversation a bit and ask Genevieve to give her insights on investor perception in the field of cell and gene therapy. But also, if I could also ask, as you talk about investor perception, if you could couple that with risks, the risk profile that investors look at, and if they still want to go in, how they consider and think about mitigating risk.
Sure. So as I would say, a purely financial investor,
What I think we'll do is make sure
the mic.
Closer.
Let me know if it doesn't work. So as a purely financial investor, of course, we're looking at that maybe from a different angle than what a pharma company is looking for, because we don't have the operational capacities and our individual capacities that you guys have. One thing I wanted to share with you maybe is a piece of work we did a few months ago. We surveyed 22 life science funds and asked them questions about what was their feeling towards cell and gene therapy companies. One of the questions that we asked them was, we all know how difficult it is to bring a small molecular biologics to approval, but when you look at a cell or gene therapy company, in what areas of your due diligence are you doing even more work than you would do in a typical development opportunity? So we asked them about reimbursement, price, cost of goods, and manufacturing. So surprisingly, most of the people didn't do more work about, or were not more concerned about reimbursement than for the traditional opportunities, but I'll have a comment about that later. But both for COGS, price, COGS, and manufacturing, they were all doing significantly more work on these topics than they would do for a regular opportunity. I think one thing we all investors embrace is the fact that cell therapies and gene therapy also, there are so many more steps that could go wrong, and so the risk associated with these opportunities is much higher than it is for a traditional opportunity. Even if you get to a point where you overcome all the development challenges, the commercial launch of these products is going to require the involvement of cell therapy centers for the administration. And it's not clear, at least for us, how exactly the business model is going to work. So when you get reimbursed for the drug, how much of that goes to the folks that develop the drug, and how much is going to go to the cell therapy centers. That's another overlay of risk. In terms of reimbursement, we see more and more innovative schemes. We see more and more products being reimbursed on success. So result-based reimbursement. This is not restricted to cell or gene therapy products, but we think that the very high cost associated with these products is going to accelerate the trend for these innovative reimbursement schemes. So I started with the bad news. The good news of our survey was that of the 22 or so healthcare-focused groups that we surveyed, 23% had never invested yet, but 100% were considering the field. So I guess this speaks to the appetite and the opportunity we see for these therapies that bring the potential of curative solutions for the company. I know that later on Bill is going to talk about how companies should get themselves organized to successfully raise money in that area. But one piece of advice I would maybe give right now is the fact that as much as we investors shop our companies and due diligence to death, I think it's very important for companies to do due diligence on investors and make sure you get associated with investors that have experience in that field, because it's really a place where you need to be A1 in so many aspects of it, and not overlook the fact to build very, very strong and diversified scientific advisory boards, because again, the challenge is probably much higher in that area than it is in the traditional opportunities. So I'm going to pause with that.
If you don't mind, let me add a few things that I think you pointed out that are very important. A little bit more from the technical, scientific aspects, but more so from entrepreneurs who are thinking of getting into the area. You mentioned you mentioned the manufacturing risks associated with some of these therapies. But it's amazing for me to appreciate the type of technologies that are being developed to overcome, some of these risks. So, for example, automated, autologous cell therapy production. Really having closed systems where you are, harvesting cells from a patient that's getting ready to have engineered CAR Ts. And then within the closed system, dramatically decreasing any risks that are associated, contamination risks, and really doing this, in a very shorter period of time. I think you mentioned Sleeping Beauty earlier. Getting away from non-viral vectors, it's going to dramatically reduce the cost And I think as entrepreneurs and as inventors, those are the areas where we'll see a lot of interesting growth and a lot of opportunities. The good news of opportunities where you identify these kinds of risks associated with, the characterization of the cells as they're being produced, and the manufacturing process that you mentioned, where there are higher chances of failing, hopefully will be overcome with a lot of next-gen sequencing, RNA sequencing, where you're better characterizing the cells that you're making, and there is consistency of generating those cells from batch to batch. So a lot of these kind of technologies and making investments into these technologies to characterize the manufacturing process and building a process that is almost foolproof, I think, is where you're going to see future growth and future investments in. I just thought I'd kind of chime that in.
Great, no, that's great. Thank you, Genevieve. And Bill, I wanted to ask you more on the fundraising side. If you could just talk about, in this particular field, fundraising strategies, and maybe some lessons learned, ways that people have successfully raised capital and ways people have unsuccessfully raised capital. I think both are equally informative. And if maybe you could share some of your experiences in that area, that would be great.
Thank you. And if you don't mind me, I do this more as a conversation amongst us. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of the research and development in this field of cell and gene therapy has been done not in pharma, but in academia. Is that correct?
Yes.
In general?
Yeah.
So we're all, and also, I think it's true that most of the major pharma companies have already recently jumped into the field with early investments and acquisitions.
Absolutely, and just to again give a little bit more depth to what you said, Bill. Carl June in the University of Pennsylvania has been the leader in this field, and of course Novartis acquired their first CAR T therapy that got approved from UPenn.
So I would imagine, this is a question, I would imagine as more evidence arrives from clinical trials underway, that there's probably an appetite in pharma to make further investments.
Absolutely. As long as the risks we spoke about briefly can be mitigated, I think that really is the key. And again, let me provide some color. We spoke about the manufacturing process, right? Yeah. And the challenges associated with them. I think people forget that before CAR Ts, there was adoptive T cell transfer, right? There were a lot of sort of therapeutic modalities where T cells from cancer patients were removed, expanded ex vivo, that specifically were targeting the tumors, and then put back into the patient with the notion that you would have an effect on tumor kill. So I think pharmaceutical companies and the field in general has learned a lot, including Provance.
Recently?
Yeah, recently.
5 years?
Yeah, it's actually almost 8 to 10 years. And most of them were failures,
right?
But they were learning lessons, right, that allowed us to understand how to.
So I think this is incredibly valuable for a fundraising company in that, at least now, if you're seeking venture investment, the firm is going to want an exit at some point fairly soon. And right now, I think the best chance of doing that is alignment with a pharmaceutical company. Now that is with tremendous bias based on the companies that we've incubated, have done major deals with pharma companies, because they have carefully listened to what you have to say about scalability concerns and safety concerns, and have offered technologies and methods that initially weren't that exciting, but when they fit into solving a major problem, that the solution to which will enable you all to do what you do best, and that is get the product out, I think is the major lesson learned in my perspective. So I think careful alignment with sort of where the field is headed and what the field is looking for, number one. And then number two, a set of investors that are able to have an intelligent conversation based on previous relationships. This sounds like such insider information, but they have previous relationships with pharmaceutical companies. In one of the cases that we incubated, SQZ Bio, which basically makes the hypothesis that the impediment to this field taking off is the ability to safely, efficiently, and scalably modify cells. That's not too sexy, is it? No. They figured out a way to squeeze the cells, open a membrane, insert the message into the cell. Membrane closes, goes back into the body, tells the B cell to go get the T cells. Different way of doing it, a lot less expensive, a lot more efficient. The range of possibilities for different indications is huge. That ended up interesting Roche 2 years ago, which did a deal with SQZ. And Roche was characteristically the last major pharma company, I think, to jump into this field with an investment. So it was alignment with Roche, but the lead venture investor in SQZ's case was Polaris, which is obviously a top-tier venture firm and headed by folks that used to have positions with pharma companies. So I think, just in my experience, alignment with pharma right now is really important, and so you just need to figure out how to have a dialogue with folks like you and carefully understand what they're looking for, and then your value proposition either aligns with them or it doesn't. Any comments on that?
No, I mean, I absolutely agree. Again, I'll provide some color. We talked about characterizing the cells as they are made, and the technologies that are, that are being developed, where there's potential, is how to get these genes into, how to do the genetic engineering in a very, very cost-effective way. And the squeeze technology is one way.
It's just one way. There's room for many other approaches like that.
Absolutely, and maybe Engine, with their formulation technology, can have applicability in very efficiently, transmit genes, as people when you're creating, generating the CAR T. So I think a lot of that technology development is going to come with a collaboration in academia and in biotech. The discoveries are going to be made in academia, and they're going to be very quickly spun out into biotech. And pharma is not a player in that space, right? They're going to watch the technology mature, and at the right time, when they believe that it's going to have an impact on developing therapeutics, that's the time that they're going to acquire it. And Bill, to your point, that's where the collaboration comes in. I think if investors, entrepreneurs, and inventors fully appreciate the challenges associated with cell-based therapies and try to address them, that's where that collaboration is going to come together.
So I think just to finish, it's doing the research and listening carefully to what players are saying they need, and then being able to sell your vision to them with not only with evidence but with dialogue over several quarters, so that they can watch sort of what progress your team is making. And but I have to underscore, sales and marketing is really important.
So I wanted to drill into this just a little bit more, and that is, do you have any examples of people doing it poorly? I mean, when there's success stories, we read about that, we know about that. Just as a quick segue, so myself representing the Dana-Farber, when we're involved in deal making, my decision making process is really, is this a partner who will help us get new drugs as quickly as possible to patients? The answer is yes. We're more than happy to transact. and work together and collaborate. And it's really, truly, if we follow that path, we almost always make the right decision. If people are in it for other reasons, then we just don't work with them. But in terms of more of an investor audience and lessons learned, I was wondering whether any of the panelists had some examples where there might have been some great technology, but the implementation plan was woeful, and I think everybody loses when there's really good technology. The opportunity to really help patients, and from a business, maybe a marketing point of view, it never sees the light of day, or that light of day was cut quite short.
Well, I have an example that comes to my mind, and I'm not saying that the company did it wrong, but I think it's an example of a case where even though all technical challenges were overcome, it didn't work. It's a story we've been following. A company created by a fund we invested in. The company was created in Amsterdam in 1998. At the time, it was called AMT. It was now after that later renamed Unicure. So these guys had the first gene therapy product approved in Western world, Glabera, for an enzyme deficiency. So the product was working. I personally know someone with a genetic defect that received it, and it did work. But it was never approved in the States. FDA was requiring new studies. There was probably an issue around the cost of it. So I think maybe then the company had to pivot, and they're now working on hemophilia. You were referring to that later, and Huntington disease. So I think it's going to be a happy ending because they were able to pivot to an indication where the regulatory and the reimbursement path is more clear. But it's also a case where when you're pioneering a field, by definition, you can run into roadblocks, and I think it's very important for people working in that field now to not only again look at the science, but look at the overall picture, CMC, regulatory reimbursement, the cost of the therapy, because this has a consequence on the price you need to charge. So for us, it was, I would say, a good poster child of how thoughtful you have to be in that field.
Right. Gary, I can add that you have to remember that the regulatory playing field is very different today for cell-based therapies, for gene therapies, than it was, I think, at that time. And you mentioned, not appreciating the full details, the FDA requirements for approval of gene therapy, just 10 years ago was very, very challenging because there were some very bad examples, right? We had an example where genes were inserted into, oncogenes, into suppressor genes, and they were causing, cancers, right? Which were not for, which was sort of at the back of everyone's mind, but here was evidence that this is what was happening. So there were a lot of, regulatory concerns on the safety of gene therapy that I think we now feel much more comfortable. We now can characterize those cells and have assurance, right, that they're not going to induce cancers. I think from implementing the discoveries, not necessarily marketing, I think there's a lot of lessons that have been learned over the years of how we need to do, gene therapy, how we need to pursue cell-based therapeutics.
Well, we all have examples. I imagine one of ours was a spin out of actually Harvard Medical School, but it was a CRISPR, licensed CRISPR technology, but for transplantation of organs from pigs to humans. In any case, she just did not have the evidence. So she had to go back to the lab in the medical school and work for about a year and a half and produced a seminal article in Science that led to a $38 million Series A investment. So she was a little early given the mountain she was climbing. So it's tricky. The enthusiasm sort of got ahead of evidence.
Interesting. And then I have one last question, and then I was going to open it up to the audience. But I wanted to ask my three panelists, if they could maybe talk about, we won't hold you to this, but what does the future look like? If you looked into your crystal ball, what do you believe the future looks like? And I'll divide it into two places, maybe 12 months from now, or 5 years from now. Just kind of thoughts, and the glass really being half full.
So I'd like to start by asking the question in a slightly different way, and that is, I think I shared with you that on the way here, I looked at all of the venture financing deals in 2018 in the Boston area. There were 89 in biopharma. About a third of them were, 40% of them were first-time financings, which is good news for y'all. But only 11% were gene and cell therapy. And I don't know if that's high or low, but my sense is it's low. I looked at all the other deals, and they're still very traditional drug development type of thing. So I think it's really early. And I'm optimistic that there'll continue to be investments in this area, particularly as pharmaceutical companies become more interested in it.
Well, I think you're talking about the partnership deals from a financing point of view.
Biobucks.
Yeah, biobucks. If you look at private financing and IPOs, a lot of money has been going into earlier stage stuff, and gene therapy has been the preferred modality in the early stage companies that have been going public. So I think it's good that the money is there. If people can apply the lessons that you alluded to, I think the future is bright. It's clear that, and you mentioned that also, the trend is really towards off-the-shelf, therefore allogenic approach as opposed to autologous. So I think the future looks bright. It's been a while that if I remember when I started in this field, it was this teenager that died in a trial, and I remember it was a big shock for everybody. But it's been more than 15 years. So I think the future is bright.
So I'll add to my enthusiasm as from a sort of a clinical, technical, scientific perspective. I see a lot of optimism in the types of technologies I think that are coming on the horizon that is going to drive the cost of generating these engineered cells down. We're going to learn more to generate engineered cells that are much more robust and active against killing tumors. There's a lot of research being done to understand resistant mechanisms. T-cell exhaustion is one example, and honing into that killer T-cell or killer NK cell that's going to have a much higher potency to kill the tumor. I think these kinds of advances are coming very rapidly, but the one that we kind of alluded to, and we got time to go into it, is the fusion of gene editing technologies, with generating engineered cells using non-viral vectors, and doing that in a very, very cost-effective, efficient, time-efficient manner, with the ultimate goal of getting allogeneic off-the-shelf cells, is where this field is heading towards, and it's getting there, very, very rapidly. We don't know which technology is going to be the winner, and a lot of these technologies are not just focused on generating the cell-based therapeutics, but these technologies are there to aid the manufacturing process to ensure that we are generating therapeutic products that have high specificity, and have, if you will, the spec that really the FDA is looking for, to get regulatory, to get it approved through the regulatory process. So very, very enthusiastic in seeing the variety of technologies that are coming forward.
Yeah, and then just from the lens that I look through, to give you some perspective. So at the Dana-Farber, I receive about 170 new invention disclosures a year, which is,
That's a lot, Gary.
That's a lot.
Can you share some of those with us?
I could after the panel. And we spin out about 3 or 4 new companies a year. Right now, I have 6 or 7 term sheets for newcos. So I'm, constantly engaged in the VC community because these startups come from, large VC groups are funding them, as well as entrepreneurs. So it's the whole spectrum. But what I've been seeing is that, as Genevieve said, the appetite for large institutional investors in this space is enormous. And not only that, but some of the venture firms that I know of have spun out sister venture firms to specifically invest in very early stage assets, which is really new. 5 or 6 years ago, the closer to the clinic, the better. As an academic cancer center, very, very rarely, I can only think of 1 or 2 examples where we have assets that are actually in the clinic. So we're always transacting, before that. But now, as I was alluding to, large VC firms have gone ahead and created entities that are solely focused on, technologies that might have in vitro data, and they're willing to invest at that stage. So I see the future as today extremely bright, and it's not just extremely bright for tomorrow. I see that it's bright today, right now. We're just about at the end, so I did want to allow a couple of questions if time permits. And feel free to engage with us one-on-one. But I want to thank Resi for the opportunity for us to participate on this panel. And I really want to thank my 3 panelists for putting all the time and effort and homework into preparing for this morning. So thank you.
Thank you very much.